Let's talk about the God of the Gaps complaint right now. This is a complaint that comes up in discussions in certain areas of science, particularly origin issues like the beginning of the universe or problems of the origin of life and possibly the development of life by a Darwinian mechanism. Now, there are problems with all of these from a materialistic perspective, and of course these are the places where Christian thinkers have been weighing in and offering explanations that seem to meet the need. Now, the complaint that comes up is that the Christian intelligent design crowd now is committing a fallacy of God of the gaps. And this is a especially frustrating objection, because this objection is not just coming from the materialists, it is coming from other Christians who do science. And the basic idea here, there are a couple of things going on. One of them is the assumption that science is the only thing that gets to weigh in on these kinds of issues. If you bring God into the discussion, then this is religion masquerading as science. Basically, the view is, if you have an explanation for something that doesn't cover all the bases, the materialistic explanation, and so there's a gap that's in place, and you can't stick God in there as a plug, because that's something that science will eventually resolve. In the past, there have been gaps. Science has filled them in. People have sometimes stuck God in there out of ignorance, and consequently, they kind of maybe impaired the process of science, properly filling it with a materialistic explanation. Okay, so that's the backdrop. Notice an underlying theme here, by the way, that this is kind of a tacit declaration that the only place for God to fill is in gaps of ignorance. So God is in the ignorance spaces, science is lined up with knowledge. How do we respond to this? There's a couple of ways that, a couple of things I think we need to keep in mind. First of all, this is a tacit acknowledgement that there is a gap, okay? Science is saying, hey, we can't fill this, all right? Or at least not yet. We hope to do it in the future. Second thing to keep in mind is when intelligent design people, unlike folks in the pre-scientific era, but ID Christian thinkers offer intelligent design as an explanation, it is not to plug a hole. It isn't like, well, we don't know what this is all about. Science hasn't been able to come up with an explanation, so let's just take God and stick it in the hole. No, this isn't what's going on. And when that's what's represented, this is a straw man fallacy. That is, they misrepresent what's the actual case. ID guys have written huge books explaining the reason why God is a better explanation given the evidence. It's not a God of the gaps. It's a God based on evidence. It's intelligent design that is suggested by the nature of the evidence right there. Okay? And this is the kind of thing that's overlooked constantly, as if the people who claim this is God of the gaps haven't even read a word of what the ID guys have written. Now, it might be that the ID guys are mistaken in their scientific conclusions based on the evidence they think that they can infer design from. But that's a different kind of discussion. In this particular case, their ideas are dismissed out of hand as God of the gaps. Here's the third thing. Notice that when science says that's God of the gaps, they are committing a science of the gaps. That is, they're saying there's a gap of knowledge there, and they are assuming and hoping that science will fill that gap. Now, what evidence do they have that science is going to fill that gap? That particular gap, none. That's why there's a gap there. So now they're doing gap filling with science without justification, where at least the ID guys are filling the gap with God with justification. That is, that there's evidence that intelligent design best explains this particular gap of knowledge. One last thing here, and this is something a lot of people haven't seen. This is actually an example of circular reasoning. Circular reasoning is when you presume your point of view in the process of trying to argue for your point of view. When scientists claim that any ID reference is going to be an example of a God of the gaps, they're presuming that there is really a gap of knowledge there. But there's only a gap if you presume a materialistic explanation, there's no materialistic explanation for it, and there must be one, and so there is a gap that you should put God in, because we'll come up with the answer later. Notice there must be one. They are presuming that materialism is correct, when that's the very thing under consideration in this whole discussion. Is the materialistic, mechanistic view of the universe adequate to explain all of these kinds of things? It doesn't look like it, but they're presuming it is, and so there's a gap of knowledge because there's no materialistic explanation. Turns out, I don't think there's a gap there, because there is an explanation that fits the evidence. So here's the basic rule. The basic rule is follow the evidence where it leads. Don't do a science of the gaps. Don't do a God of the gaps. If you're missing an explanation for something and the evidence suggests a materialistic explanation, go with that. If you're missing an explanation and there is evidence suggesting intelligent design, you can't disqualify it with this lame dismissal called God of the gaps. You've got to follow the evidence where it leads if you're going to be intellectually honest.